The Murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. It was late evening on May 28, 1980, as Conrad Bostrom and Pam Head stood outside UC Irvine Medical Center waiting for their coworker Dorothy Jane Scott to pull her car around and pick them up. As the headlights pulled into view, they readied to meet Dorothy, both eager to be done with the day. Then, something strange happened. As the headlights of Dorothy's car shone into their eyes, the person driving seemed to suddenly slam on the accelerator and speed off. That's odd, Pam and Conrad must have thought. Dorothy was supposed to be taking them home. Little did they know, Dorothy Scott would disappear that night, and a mystery that has gone on to span almost half a century was born. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April 23, 1948, to parents Jacob and Vera. At the time of her disappearance, she worked as a secretary for two jointly owned companies, Swinger's Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. By all accounts, Dorothy lived a quiet life. She was a diligent worker who avoided drugs and alcohol. She much preferred to spend time at home with her 4-year-old son, Sean, and attend church on the weekends. Sean's father didn't live close enough to help with his day-to-day care, and that is where Jacob and Vera, Dorothy's parents, stepped in. While she was at work, Jacob and Vera would watch Sean. Back at her home in Stanton, Dorothy lived with her aunt who would have provided additional support where needed. All in all, Dorothy was blessed to have a loving family and good friends. She had a solid job and seemed to be making a good life for herself. On May 28th, it began like a usual day for Dorothy. She got ready for work and put Sean in the car before taking the short drive from Stanton to Anaheim, where she dropped her son off before carrying on to a staff meeting being held at her workplace. While in the meeting, Dorothy noticed one of her coworkers, Conrad Bostrom, didn't look so well. When she then saw an obvious red mark on his arm, which she guessed might have been a spider bite, Dorothy was concerned enough to offer to drive Conrad to the local medical center. Another one of their colleagues, Pam Head, offered to accompany the pair, and they all set off in Dorothy's car. It was already late into the evening by that stage, and Dorothy made sure to quickly stop in at her parents' home to see Sean and tell her parents that she would be picking him up later than usual. Before she left, Dorothy threw off her black scarf for a bright red one that would keep her warmer. It turned out that Dorothy did Conrad a real favor by insisting he go to the emergency room. Doctors were able to confirm the red mark on his arm was a bite from a black widow spider. He was briefly admitted for the necessary treatment before being discharged at roughly 11 p.m. Dorothy and Pam had stayed at the medical center while Conrad was being seen to, and now that he had been discharged, they were ready to go home. Dorothy told Conrad and Pam to wait inside while she went to get her car. This was the last known sighting of Dorothy Scott alive. After a short time passed, Conrad and Pam made their way out of the medical center to go and find Dorothy. It wasn't long before they both spotted her white station wagon, and it looked as if Dorothy had seen the pair as well. Her car turned in their direction, its headlights briefly blinding them as they waited for her to pull up alongside them. Only that's not what had happened. Instead, the car sped past Pam and Conrad, making a sharp turn out of the parking lot and disappearing into the night. Since neither of them saw whether Dorothy was driving or not, they both assumed there must have been an issue with her son that she was rushing home to. As the hours passed, however, they realized this wasn't the case and reported her missing. By 4:30 a.m. the next morning, the police already had their first major development in the search for Dorothy. Around 10 miles from the medical center where she was last seen, down an alleyway, her car was found abandoned. To make matters worse, it had been set alight. This worrying discovery led investigators to start looking into Dorothy's disappearance as an abduction case. One of the first steps in these sorts of investigations is getting a clear picture of Dorothy's personal life. The authorities want to be able to comb through everyone who surrounded her to try and gain as much information and hopefully clues as possible. Much of what they learned in the early days was unremarkable. That was until a close friend of Dorothy told the investigators about the phone calls. It started back in early 1980 with a single phone call that Dorothy answered while working her receptionist job. The unidentified man on the other end of the line began calling back repeatedly, confessing his love for Dorothy. After a while, the man began making more sinister phone calls, threatening to harm Dorothy and cut her up into bits so no one will ever find her. It took Dorothy some time before she brought this up to her family, likely because she didn't want to worry them. One of the scariest incidents came when Dorothy got yet another call from this unidentified man, who told her to go outside to find what he had left for her. She went out and there was a single dead red rose on the windshield of her car, Dorothy's mother recalled. After that, this was no longer some invisible man on the other end of a phone line. He posed a real threat to her. Dorothy never thought for a second she would own a gun, but she started to seriously consider it for her own safety. Not long before she disappeared, Dorothy even began taking karate classes in an effort to learn how to better defend herself. When hearing about Dorothy's case, many asked why she didn't go to the authorities to report this behavior. To understand her decision, you need to remember this took place in 1980. Even today, women often find it exceedingly difficult to get assistance from law enforcement regarding suspected stalking cases. Back then, with the lack of awareness of stalking and what it can lead to, it was unlikely Dorothy would have received any help. So what happened to Dorothy's stalker once she disappeared? Well, the phone calls didn't stop. This time it was Dorothy's mom who was bombarded with calls from an unidentified man. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" the anonymous caller asked. Vera immediately replied that she was, and that was met with the response, "I've got her," before the caller hung up. Vera called the investigators working on her daughter's case and told them what had happened. They felt this could be a serious lead and set up voice recording devices in Vera's home to document any further phone calls. The man on the other end had a loose schedule he'd liked to stick to. Practically every Wednesday afternoon, he would make a call to the Scott's home and briefly speak to Vera. He somehow managed to time these calls to all happen when she was home alone. They often followed two patterns. He either told Vera that he had her daughter or that he had killed her before hanging up again. This went on for years until one afternoon in early 1984, it was Jacob who answered the phone. After that, the call stopped. After more than 4 years of wondering where Dorothy was out there, the search for her came to an end. It was August 6, 1984. Construction was underway on Santa Ana Canyon Road. While walking 30 feet off the road, one of the workers stumbled across a set of human remains. The site was cordoned off and a forensic team came in to see what they could recover. The bones had been charred from wildfires that swept through the area previously, but the coroner felt he would be able to make an identification through dental records. The forensic team was also able to uncover a turquoise ring and a watch at the site. They both belonged to Dorothy Scott. On August 14th, the official reports came back. The remains found did in fact belong to Dorothy. Unfortunately, due to the level of decomposition, a cause of death could not be determined. Even though they didn't know what happened to their beautiful girl, Vera and Jacob at least now had the opportunity to lay her to rest. When the news broke, Dorothy's mother received one last phone call from the man who had taunted her for all those years. "Is Dorothy home?" he asked before hanging up like he always did. Despite multiple attempts to trace these calls, they always ended too quickly for the police to be able to get even a vague idea of where they were coming from. And with the discovery of her body, Dorothy's case went cold. To this day, we still don't know who was responsible for ripping Dorothy away from all who loved her that night in the hospital parking lot. Was it the sinister man on the other end of the phone? Or was it someone entirely unknown to Dorothy? Some stranger out on the prowl that night? We may never know.